Hi, my name is Caitlin Duffner. I'm a third-year physical therapy student at Ohio State University, and this is part 5 of my 6-part project called Bridging the Gap Between Physical Therapy and Adaptive Sports. The purpose of my project is to provide physical therapists and physical therapy students with an introduction to adaptive sports to better treat the wheelchair athlete. The first 4 parts included the intro and benefits to adaptive sports, wheelchair basketball, and push rim racing intro. Part 5, which is this lecture, is going to include push rim racing biomechanics. The objectives for today are to break down the racing propulsion cycle, review muscles involved in wheelchair racing, learn force application during racing, and examine how speed affects mechanics. So first we're going to break down the push cycle. So it's broken down into 6 parts, which is a little bit more complex than what we saw in the biomechanics lecture of wheelchair basketball. But the first phase here is acceleration. So you're getting those hands as high as you can. You're getting a lot of shoulder extension. And then you go into impact energy transfer, where your hands are hitting the hand ring. And then you go into force application, where you're really putting force through the ring. And then 4 is the rotation energy transfer. So you're really getting that final rotation push into the ring. And then you get cast off, where you're releasing your hands from the ring, and you'll backswing from cast off back to 1, and where you'll start your acceleration. So the way that this is broken down here into these 6 phases isn't the way that everyone breaks them down. Some of the newer ways are using acceleration here, but instead of impact energy transfer, you'll have a load phase, which includes initial contact and hand loading. Then you'll have a drive phase instead of this force application phase. You'll have release, which is the same thing as cast off, and then you'll have a separating phase, which is similar to the backswing. It's just where your hands are separating from the ring. But they're all very similar. That's just a difference of verbiage there. So some coaches use this way, some coaches use the other way. It's very similar to the gait cycle, where they just use different ways to describe kind of the same thing. So if we look here, this is a T53 athlete, and we're just going to watch her push. This is in slow motion. So her hands get really high. She's getting a lot of shoulder extension. She's getting that acceleration. Where I paused it here, that's where she's getting her impact energy transfer, and she goes quickly into force application. And then we're getting our rotation energy transfer here, where her wrists are rotating at the bottom of the ring. And then we get cast off when she releases, and we've got our backswing here. So she comes back in to accelerate, hits the ring. We've got impact energy transfer, force application, rotation, cast off, and then backswing. So that's kind of what it looks like. Again, this is in slow motion. So now we'll go ahead and break down the specific muscle actions during each part. So going from acceleration to impact energy transfer, you're going from a shoulder extension here and moderate abduction, and then you're getting shoulder flexion, max abduction, and internal rotation here when you hit the hand ring. So the prime movers here are going to be your biceps, anterior and middle delt, and your pec major. During impact energy transfer here, you're going to get peak extensor carpi radialis activation, and your max hand velocity, so going from all the way up here to all the way down here, is going to increase with increased total speed. So as you go faster, you're going to try to get those hands moving as fast as possible. So when they hit the ring, your hands are going faster than the ring, because if your hands are going slower than the ring, then you're going to effectively slow yourself down. You're just going to have the opposite effect of what you want. And then this small push ring, small in comparison to the wheel, allows for increased acceleration. So you have more room from when your hands are back here in the backswing to when you're hitting the ring, and that allows your hands to go faster. It gives you a little bit more room there. So your hand position here when you're hitting the ring is going to be wrist pronation, extension, and radial deviation when you initially hit the ring. So we'll move on to the force application phase. So during this phase, like you saw Chelsea doing before, you're not actually gripping the ring, the hand ring. You're more so punching your hands against the ring with gloves to produce a rotational force. And so you need a little bit of a medial force to create that friction between your gloves and the hand ring in order to move the ring forward. So the prime movers here are going to be your pec major, anterior delt, and triceps. And so, like I said before, the wrist is initially an extension, pronation, and radial deviation. As soon after it hits, you get a quick supination to get some power there. And then when you're accelerating in a race, you're going to use shorter pushes. So when you're really trying to be explosive, you're going to use short, fast pushes. And then once you get up to speed, you're going to use long, more fluid pushes. So we'll look at force application here. So you can see on this diagram, here's the hand ring, here's your elbow, that's where your wrist would be. And you can kind of see the different aspects of the force here. This tangential force is the main force that you want to actually push the rim forward. It's not all going into that pure tangential force. You're going to have some force down. You're going to need some force that's going medially into the ring in order to have some sort of friction in between your gloves and the ring in order to have an effective push. But it's also interesting to see how much total force athletes are putting in the ring. These studies are some of them are a little bit older, and they're not all using the same types of gloves. There are different types of situations. So it's not, you look at this with a grain of salt, but the total force here is around like 400 and 500 newtons, which is a decent amount of force. And not all of it is going in the correct direction. Like you're going to have some medial force, you're going to have a radial force, you have a little bit of a tangential force, but it kind of all comes together as that like 400, 500 newtons. So next we'll look at rotation and energy transfer to cast off. So here we're going to have wrist pronation again, ulnar deviation, and flexion. So your wrist went from that, when you initially hit the ring, you're going to have wrist extension, pronation, and radial deviation. You're going to get that supination initially. And now here at the rotation, energy transfer, and cast off, you're going to get pronation again, ulnar deviation, and flexion. So we're doing a lot of wrist motion with this pushing style. Your elbow in this phase does not reach full extension. It's always going to have a little bit of flexion. It's going to come close, but it's never going to reach peak extension. And your shoulder here is going to be adducted, internally rotated, and extended. Peak activity for this phase is in the posterior and middle delt and low trap. So you're getting a lot of shoulder extension. The last phase we'll talk about is the backswing. So this is where you're going from cast off all the way back to your peak shoulder extension when you can start acceleration again. So this is called a butterfly technique. Concentrically, what's happening here, you're using your supraspinatus, posterior delt, mid and low trap. And then eccentrically, your biceps and anterior and middle delt are working to slow your arm down once you get up to your peak. So when you're accelerating in a race, either at the beginning or at the end to really kind of kick it in, you're going to use a higher and faster backswing, which is going to increase your shoulder extension more so than you would in submaximal pushing. And that allows for increased hand velocity on hand impact on the ring. So we talked about how you really want your hands moving as fast as they can in order to not slow down the hand ring when you're pushing. So we'll take a look at some more footage here. This again is Chelsea. She's a T53 athlete. So you can really see how when she hits the hand ring, you're going to get pronation, radial deviation, and extension. Right now she's in the supination part. She moves into supination, and then at the end she gets pronation, flexion, and ulnar deviation. So we look at that again. When she first hits, she gets pronation, radial deviation, and extension, quickly moves into supination, ends up in pronation, ulnar deviation, and flexion. You can also appreciate how much shoulder extension is going on here. And she does have a little bit of trunk movement. It's not a lot. Usually racers don't want a lot of trunk movement. You want that kind of as stable as possible. And she's very parallel to the ground, which is proper form. So if we look at this other view, you can really appreciate how much abduction and internal rotation she gets when she initially pushes on the ring. So her arms are kind of at a severe angle there. And she really gets that flick at the end to try and get that rotational power at the end of her stroke. So I also included, this is me, some bad biomechanics or what not to do for funsies. But as you can see here, I'm definitely not parallel to the ground, which I should be. Apparently hip flexion is not something that I'm known for. I'm getting a decent amount of trunk flexion too, which probably isn't good. But the real kicker is my hands are on the ring for like a tiny portion of the whole cycle. So like I'm just getting a tiny little push here. I'm not getting any sort of rotation transfer at the bottom here. You can also see my eyes. I'm kind of looking at the ring because I don't really know where my hands are in space. And so I was like missing the ring a lot of times. You can't really tell in this video, but like half the time I wasn't even hitting the ring. It's like hard, it's way harder than you would think it would be. So obviously I'm not a professional like Chelsea, but I think it's interesting to see the difference between like a completely novice person who's never done this before and someone who's like a Paralympian. I think that's kind of a cool thing to look at. So there's that. And then I have my resources. So they're just a bunch of YouTube links of how chairs are made, some different racing mechanics. They go through some slow-mo video as well. That's kind of helpful. Intro to racing, and then 2 Paralympic events. And these are my references. Stick around for the 6th and final video, which will include entry and prevention for wheelchair athletes, specifically wheelchair basketball and track.